Robert Spencer argues that there are radical jihadists working in the U.S. today as part of a larger international jihad network that has been involved in many events over the past years, including the Arab Spring. This is a little over an hour.
Thank you very much. Michael mentioned the Glazov Gang. It's a TV show that we run at Front Page Magazine, and it would not have been possible for not my producer. Annie, can you stand for a minute? Please give her a hand. She made Front Page's TV show possible. Thank you. And my show wouldn't be so successful if Robert wasn't running it on Jihad Watch every week. Thank you, Robert. On September 21st, 2013, the Islamic terrorist group Al-Shabaab launched its 4-day siege of Kenya's Westgate shopping mall, turning it into a literal slaughterhouse. The jihadists raped, tortured, beheaded, dismembered, castrated, gouged out eyes, amputated fingers, and hung hostages on hooks from the roof. Now, I'm sorry to bring this up during our lunch. I don't mean to be ruining our lunch here today. But the reason I bring it up, ladies and gentlemen, is that barbaric terror gave the Islamic stamp to that slaughterhouse. Because in Islamic theology, ritual murders involving torture, dismemberment, and mutilation are considered necessary sacred acts against the kafir. Muslims' impurities are cleansed, humiliation is avenged, and honor is restored by the bloodshed achieved through mutilation of the infidel. The jihadists in Kenya engaged in another intriguing selection process. They freed Muslims and tortured and murdered non-Muslims. One of the survivors recounted how the jihadists asked him the name of Muhammad's mother, and when he couldn't answer, they shot him. Women and children who could not recite the Quran or name the mother of the Prophet were killed. The jihadists released anyone who could prove they were Muslim by reciting a Muslim prayer. In response to this horrifying act of terror, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron led the way perfectly for the West in the context of the mindset that now prevails in our culture. He condemned the attacks, but implored everyone, begged everyone to keep in mind that the victims in Kenya's Westgate shopping mall and what they suffered had nothing to do with Islam. And as we know, this is the prevailing mindset in our leadership, in our media. When the media reported on what happened in Nairobi, the word Islam somehow eluded the reports and the reporters' imaginations. The jihadists were referred to as militants, maniacs, gunmen, etc. We know this story well, ladies and gentlemen. It's the story of our civilization's surrender to a totalitarian and vicious ideology, a surrender that is transpiring right now, right before our eyes. Because of the left's chokehold on our permitted boundaries of discourse, our leadership, in our media, in academia, in our higher literary culture, we cannot fight, let alone name the enemy that at this very moment is taking us down bit by bit. On the Glazov Gang this week, Mark Dury, that was on, used a very interesting metaphor. He said that there's a huge instinct in many people that when they're having, what's a good word to use? When they're being beaten up, I didn't want to use certain words, when they're being beaten up and they have a blindfold on, there is an instinct and a desire not to take the blindfold off, to see who's beating you and to try to save yourself. And so this blindfold at this moment is the metaphor to what's happening. The kidnapping of the Nigerian girls, when the leader of that extremist group praises Allah and talks about selling them. This is encoded in Sharia. In Islam, this is inspired and sanctioned by Islam in terms of slavery and rape, but we don't, of the kafir, but we don't hear this in our media. We know about the Tsarnaevs of the Boston Massacre, all the jihadi themes of Tamerlan and Johar, and yet the media the entire time was struggling. Was it the boxing? Was it the brain damage from the boxing? Was it the rap music? And this is what's happening because there's something that can't be named. And I could go on and on, ladies and gentlemen. I think Fort Hood serves as an example, that we had a quote-unquote psychiatrist in the U.S. Army teaching in lectures that acid should be poured down infidels' throats, and no one complained because they were afraid of being called racist and Islamophobic. And so this situation, this phenomena, is today making us vulnerable to jihad and making it impossible for us to protect ourselves from a threat we can't name and are not allowed to name. And so the most important part of my introduction now is that a hero has entered the stage. Robert Spencer, a New York Times best-selling author, director of Jihad Watch, which is a program of our Freedom Center. Jihad Watch is one of the most important sites on the face of the earth, just slightly below in importance to Front Page Magazine and the Glazoff Gang. He is the author of 13 books, and now his new book, Arab Winter Comes to America, The Truth About the War We're In. And the themes, in full detail, he's discussing and describing this phenomena that I'm referring to. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our modern-day Alexander Solzhenitsyn, facing yet another evil empire. But this time, this empire is the empire of the alliance between the left and Islam. This is an empire that, as we sit here at this very moment, is unleashing lethal blows at the foundations of our civilization. And all the while, this empire has succeeded in speaking the truth about its existence and actions, thought crimes and hate speech crimes. So what's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is that with its conniving and vicious agenda, this evil empire has succeeded in making the truth about its evil. It's labeled as evil itself. To oppose this evil is evil. And so saying the truth about Islam is now categorized as hate speech, racism, Islamophobia, etc. So I want to finish my introduction by just talking about Robert, what's happening to him, and who he is. Because these slanders that the evil empire is using are cast at him every day. The unholy alliance of the left and Islam have attempted to dehumanize him through their smears and slanders and name-calling. But I want to talk just for a little bit about Robert Spencer himself because, you know, I'm very interested in how the Soviet Union tried to wipe my father out of history and tried to dehumanize him for standing up against the Soviet Empire. And they have tried to dehumanize Robert. He's a hateful man. He's an Islamophobe, etc. But I want to spend 2 minutes, you know, if people want to know about Robert, come and ask me. If these people in the media think he's a hateful person, come and talk to me because I've known him for more than a decade. I hang around with him. We talk on the phone all the time. And I think it is important to say, number one, I just want to say, for people that might not know a little bit, this wasn't an obsessed man with Islam that wanted to come forward and just start hating all Muslims. This was actually a person that was on the phone brainstorming one day many years ago with a publisher. I think it was at Regnery, to my my best knowledge. And they were brainstorming, and the person said, hey, why don't you write about Islam? You know, it's an important topic right now, etc. This is, in many ways, Robert is a reluctant dissident, and this isn't necessarily pejorative. What I mean is that Robert said, okay, let me take a look. And he came and he saw 4 marbles. And he added the 4 marbles up, and 2 plus 2 was 4. And it was as simple as that. This is a person that came and studied something. He added up 2 plus 2 was 4, and it was common sense. Islam, jihad, everything that he's added up. And now, because the left is in control of our culture, he is called every name of the book. He's been slandered. He's been shut out of the media, of our culture. He's been banned from the United Kingdom. But I know this person that's been called a hateful man. I've spent a lot of time with him. He's very funny. He'll maybe tell you a few jokes tonight. Has a tremendous sense of humor, is very kind, is very loving. And what's also very much impressed me, I have to say, Robert, is how nobly and stoically you've embraced and kind of accepted your persecution. I just want to paint a little picture about Robert as a human being that, I was kind of thinking of even this image a little bit. Imagine you're in an apartment complex and you're coming up to each door and everyone in that complex is saying, you're a racist, you're an Islamophobe, you caused the death of all those little kids by Breivik, that's your fault, get out of here, you're not welcome here, you're evil, you're hateful. And then Robert kind of just comes up nonchalantly to my door, knocks on the door, and I open it, and he says, hey buddy, you want to go get something to eat? And what I mean by that image is I've always been very impressed, Robert, with how you've kept your dignity, your sanity, and magnanimity, your courage, and your nobility throughout all of this. I'm going to let Robert talk about his book. It's a magnificent book. It spells out what our enemy is up to and how the denial about what our enemy is doing is damaging us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege to introduce one of the bravest and courageous freedom fighters and truth-tellers walking our planet today. His warnings shine a light at precisely what the West is at this moment doing to lose. But at the same time, this very important book is shining a light at what our civilization can and must do if it wants to save itself from the suicidal path it's on. Ladies and gentlemen, an honor and a privilege to introduce the Alexander Solzhenitsyn of our time, Robert Spencer.
Thank you, Jamie, for that extraordinary and somewhat hyperbolic introduction. I want to get it needle-pointed, framed on my wall. But now I feel like I have to be funny since he said I would be, so I'll give you one joke to start with. There was a little boy, Muhammad, and he was 5 years old. He was in the supermarket with his mother, but as often happens, he got separated from her and was crying and taken to the manager of the store, and the manager said, what does your mother look like, little Muhammad? And he said, I have no idea. And that actually very neatly encapsulates the stark difference in the vision for society and way of life that we face today between the Islamic world and the West. But I come to you today, actually, it's rather an amazing situation. Now, what Jamie has said is true, that for years, people who have criticized Islamic law and noted the aggressive and expansionistic and supremacist aspects of Islam have been vilified, demonized, smeared, and marginalized. But I can tell you now, it's all okay. It's all over. And I'd like to thank Jay Leno and Michelle Obama for being here today. Could you stand up? Oh, they're not here? Oh, oddly enough. You may have seen, of course, that Jay Leno is leading the fight of the Hollywood glirati against the Beverly Hills Hotel for having the misfortune of being owned by the Sultan of Brunei, where they have just imposed the fullness of Islamic law, including the stonings and amputations, the systematic denial of women's rights, the systematic denial of the rights of non-Muslims and gays, and so on. And suddenly, after many years of denying that this was anything but hateful, bigoted, racist, and intolerant to notice, suddenly it is the cause of Hollywood. And so I wonder, are they going to go back and redo The Sum of All Fears, the Tom Clancy movie that in the novel that Tom Clancy wrote, the villains were Islamic jihadis, but in the movie they're neo-Nazis? And are they going to produce Alice in Arabia After All that ABC just dropped because it gave the hint of some sort of criticism of Islamic law? And they were pressured by Islamic supremacist groups like notably the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations. And, you know, it's really just incredible to be now on the side of all those who know and act upon what is good at all times, after being out in the cold for so long. And I look forward to the First Lady's next hashtag about this, because I'm sure, you know, can you imagine the Boko Haram By the way, you know, they never tell you this in the media. Boko Haram is not really the name of the group. Boko Haram means Western education is sin, and they'll tell you that. But the name of the group is the Party of the People of the Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad. Sunnah being accepted Islamic practice, Dawah being Islamic proselytizing. But if they told you that name, then it would be very clear what the group is all about. And that ain't going to be in any hashtag from the First Lady, you can be sure. And this indicates, of course, exactly the problem. All these years, we've been told that it was racist and bigoted and Islamophobic to note the human rights abuses inherent in Islamic law and to speak out against them. And yet, the only people who have been speaking out against them have been tarred and demonized in the same way. See, Jamie, his introduction was wonderful, and I am going to get it framed, but the fact is that what's happened in regard to me is not in the least singular, and that anyone and everyone, without exception and without mercy, is tarred and smeared in exactly the same way if they speak the truth about jihad terror and Sharia and Islamic supremacism. There has been and is no one spared. And yet, these are the only people speaking out about these things. Let me give you an example. Everybody knows Boko Haram now, and everybody knows they abducted those schoolgirls. Some people may know, probably most of you in this room know, that this is not in the least their first operation, but they've been doing this for years. They go into schools and they burn the school down and shoot the people trying to escape. They have gone into churches, torched the churches, killed the Christians there. They have been operating with so much impunity in Nigeria over the last few months that they have been responsible for over 2,500 deaths in the first 3 months of 2014 alone. The government of Nigeria appears to be powerless to stop them and also is probably in some significant part unwilling to stop them. Now, in regard to all this activity of Boko Haram, what if you wanted to know about it? Well, you could go to Jihad Watch, and I would recommend that. And you could do a search for the words Boko Haram, and you would see that there, if you did that at Jihad Watch, there are 115,000 results. In other words, I've mentioned Boko Haram at Jihad Watch and covered their activities 115,000 times over the last 11 years. If you go to this website of the Council on American Islamic Relations and you type in Boko Haram in their search, there is one result. One. Now look, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is well established by the Justice Department as being linked to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, is responsible primarily for having made it a matter of popular knowledge and general wisdom that anybody who criticizes jihad terror is a bigoted Islamophobe motivated by hate and by greed. And yet, if you read their last Islamophobia report, because CARE puts these out periodically, they will tell you, well, there is actually legitimate criticism of Islam and jihad. But these guys, Spencer and David Horowitz and Pamela Geller and all the rest of them, they're out of bounds. There's one thing they don't do, though. They don't say who's in bounds. Ever. Even though they pay lip service to the possibility that there is legitimate criticism of Islam and jihad, they don't actually specify who embodies that legitimate criticism. And the fact is that the claim itself is a red herring designed to mask the fact that they don't really believe that there is any legitimate criticism of Islam, even including jihad terror, such as we see Boko Haram committing these days. They really don't think there is any legitimate criticism of Sharia, such as we see imposed by the Sultan of Brunei over this past month, and what has been in force for years in Saudi Arabia and Iran and parts of Somalia and Sudan and so on. What this is all about, this smearing of people who speak up against this, is very clear. It is an attempt to absolutely rule out of bounds any criticism of jihad terror so that jihad terror and Islamic law can advance unimpeded and unimposed. That is what it's all about. Now, the reason why we're in this fix is not really because of that at all. We could expect a group with ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood to do something like that. What we may not have expected, what I certainly didn't expect when I started doing this work publicly, is that the mainstream media would go along in complete 100% lockstep. And, even worse, that since Barack Obama has become president especially, but even before that to some degree, the US government and law enforcement apparatus would go along as well. And yet they have. Now, it used to be that I would train FBI agents and military, CIA on occasion. The CIA was great to go into because, you practically had to strip to your shorts just to get in the building. And then you'd go in and, you'd go into the FBI and they all had nameplates around the table. John Smith and Jim Jones and Sarah whatever. And you went into the CIA and it was all just Joe, Frank, Bill. Nobody had a last name in there. But anyway, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say I spoke to the CIA, but I figure all bets are off now. And the reason why is because when I spoke to those agencies in those years, this is starting from about 2006 or so to 2011, there was always tension. And I always heard from the agents who invited me that there were people higher up who were not happy about this. And we either had to do it on the QT or they were fighting against their superiors and they had to promise to bring in somebody from CARE or something like that. Now, in the first place, imagine how extraordinary a situation that was to start with. That in the centers of intelligence and law enforcement of the United States, you could not speak without controversy about the motives and goals of the enemy. Because that's what I was there to do. I would go in and bring a Quran and teach them about Islam. Because obviously you cannot defeat an enemy you cannot understand. And so that should have been just basic. Imagine if in 1942 you had somebody go in and open Mein Kampf and tell them all about Nazism, but then you had to have a Nazi come in to give the other point of view. It would have been beyond absurd. But it got worse. That was bad enough, but it got much worse. I never liked the idea of having to do it silently and quietly. And I was my own worst enemy in this, because what happened was, one time I was speaking at a military base in Louisville, Kentucky, and the commander, a colonel, brought me in, and he was very kind, and he said, how happy they were to have me there, and they really wanted to hear my presentation, and so on, and I just couldn't tell anybody I was there. Because if I did, then CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, would cause a big controversy. And so I said to him, sir, with respect, why would a Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood front group be dictating who the US military can hear and who they can't? Why would a group that's demonstrably on the other side have any say in this at all? And why should we care if they cause a fuss? And he said, well, nevertheless, he was working on orders himself. Anyway, what happened was a couple of the military officers who invited me there, they said they didn't like that any more than I did, and they posed for a picture with me, and I put it up at Jihad Watch saying that I had been there. And sure enough, the controversy ensued. But it was far more virulent than I had expected. What happened was the Council on American Islamic Relations mounted a national campaign to get me removed as a trainer of intelligence and military personnel. They got Jesse Jackson to sign a petition saying that I should be removed. I thought, wow, Jesse Jackson's heard of me. That's weird enough to start with. But anyway, they ultimately made this a much larger campaign. And it culminated on October 19th, 2011. On October 19th, 2011, 57 Muslim organizations, Muslim and allied organizations, many of which had ties, once again, to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, delivered a letter to John Brennan, who was then the Homeland Security Advisor, and now, of course, is the head of the CIA. And in it, they said, you have these Islamophobic trainers, and look, Spencer spoke at a military base in Louisville, Kentucky. That's absolutely unacceptable. And see, they were right. I should have kept quiet about it. But maybe I shouldn't have, because I still believe that it's not right for groups with ties to jihad terror groups to be dictating who the military can hear and who they can't. But the wind was not blowing in the right direction. And so they named a few other trainers who they found unacceptable, and they set out a number of books and various training materials that they said were Islamophobic, were hateful, were offensive to Muslims, and they demanded that all this be removed. Now here again, an analogy is helpful. Can you imagine if the German-American Bund in 1942 had written to FDR and said, we demand that you take Mein Kampf and all this material out of your training of agents who are dealing with counterintelligence because it's offensive to Germans? Can you imagine? But this is what happened. Brennan wrote back immediately, and he wrote back on White House stationery as if to emphasize how seriously they took this as a problem. And he said, of course, yes, we will not only comply, we will not only scrub all the materials of any mention of Islam and jihad in connection with terrorism, and we will not only fire all these trainers, we will re-educate every agent who has been trained by this material or by these trainers. Chairman Mao would have been pleased. In any case, what this was the apotheosis of the long effort by the Council on American Islamic Relations and its allied groups to absolutely rule out of bounds the idea that there's any connection between Islam and terrorism. Now, of course, the obvious problem with that is that Islamic jihadis keep associating Islam with terrorism. But the sleight of hand that is performed in that instance is that it is ascribed to the Islamophobes, the link between Islam and terrorism. In other words, I can tell you, for example, that the Grand Mufti of the Caucasus recently complained that in the US there was a tendency of Islamophobes to link Islam with terrorism. And I think, well, you know, I wish I were that good, but really, I don't have to link Islam with terrorism, and even if I did, nobody would listen. The fact is, Islamic jihadis keep linking Islam with terrorism. But that is what they don't want you to notice. That is the man behind the curtain to whom you must pay no attention. When the US government agreed to adopt that as its official policy, it endangered us all. It's obvious, and the results have been clear. We have seen them twice now. We have seen them at Fort Hood, and we have seen them in Boston. In the book, I have the performance evaluations that Major Nidal Malik Hassan received as an Army psychiatrist from his superiors. And they said, he's a great officer. They said, he has unique insights, and American soldiers can learn a lot from him about Islam. And I think, yeah, American soldiers did learn a lot from him about Islam on November 4th, 2009, when he shot 13 Americans while screaming Allahu Akbar, after handing out Qurans that morning and telling a neighbor that he was going to do a great work for God that day. But that, of course, is not the lessons that they expected. Now, were these people fools? Were they idiots? Well, let me give you a little more information about what happened. At the time that he got these glowing performance evaluations, and that one was not the only one, there's several of them, he was already in touch, and he was known to be in touch with Anwar al-Awlaki, who was at that time living in Yemen. He was already on record as having called for violent jihad against the West to such a degree that he had frightened his co-workers. And that was known. If anybody should have known that, it was his superiors. So why did they say he was a great officer? and keep giving him these great evaluations so that he kept getting promoted? Well, the answer is clear. They knew which way the wind was blowing as well. They knew what happened to people who spoke about Islam and jihad. They could envision the CNN expose, Islamophobia in the military. Pious Muslim army major, psychiatrist and army major, disciplined merely for expressing his Islamic faith. Racism in the military, New York Times banner story. Palestinian army major investigated solely for teaching about Islam. Hate in the military. Who would have been disciplined? Not Major Hassan. The people who would have been disciplined, the people whose careers would have been ruined, would have obviously been his superiors had they given him an honest evaluation. They knew that. Everyone knew that. And they acted upon it. And 13 people are dead because of it. Same thing in Boston. Right around the same time that John Brennan got that letter from Muslim advocates and the 57 Muslim organizations, the Russian government gave the FBI some information about Tamerlan Tsarnaev. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, of course, was the mastermind of the Boston Marathon jihad bombing in April 15th, 2013. This is in 2011. They say, there's this guy in Boston, Tamerlan Tsarnaev. He's from Chechnya. He's a follower of radical Islam and a strong believer. That's how they put it. And he tried to join underground groups in Dagestan. Obviously, the only underground groups in Dagestan are jihad terror groups. And he's a strong believer, and he's a follower of radical Islam. What the Russians told the FBI was that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was a jihad terrorist. That should have been enough to put him under surveillance. That should have been enough to keep him under surveillance. That should have been enough such that when 3 of his friends and acquaintances, people that he boxed with, who also were Jews, were found with their throats slit on September 11th, 2011, the 10th anniversary of 9/11, he ought to have been questioned for that. He ought to have been investigated for it. It wasn't until after the Boston Marathon jihad bombing that he was linked to it, and it's found, now we know he did it. Why wasn't he questioned? Why wasn't he brought in? Why was he not under surveillance at the time when he's assembling the materials for the pressure cooker bomb, the exact ingredients of which were listed in Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine, which is readily available online, such that even an FBI agent, even a PC FBI agent, who's been re-educated by John Brennan, could read Inspire magazine and see what ingredients you need to gather for a pressure cooker bomb. And here's this guy that the Russians told you is a terrorist, and he's buying them all. You'd think they might have paid attention. But they didn't. And why didn't they? Well, it's the same thing. Imagine if you're an FBI agent and you get that information from the Russians. You're either an FBI agent of the new regime, the Brennan-Obama regime, or you're an FBI agent of the old regime, re-educated or no. And so, in other words, if you're one of the new people, you might not have any clear idea of what that means or what the implications of it are. You know, he tries to join an underground group. Oh, okay. Well, what? Was he into heavy metal or something? What does that mean? He is a follower of radical Islam. Well, we all know Islam is a religion of peace. It's been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists who twist and misinterpret its peaceful teachings. But nonetheless, how bad could it be? He's a jihadi? Oh, well, isn't that nice? He's following the interior spiritual struggle to better himself. How wonderful. Or you know better because you have some sense and you have some eyes and you have a brain, and so you see that this guy is a risk. But you know, if you say to your superiors, well, I think we should be tailing this guy 24 hours a day, I think we should be watching this man very closely, then they'll say, why? Well, he's a follower of radical Islam. Well, you can't do that. It's not in the political climate these days just to keep somebody under surveillance under those circumstances. And so the FBI went back to the Russians and asked for more information, and the Russians wouldn't give it to them. So what? They gave them enough already. But that was enough for the New York Times at the time, right before the first anniversary of the Boston bombing a few weeks ago. They actually published a story saying FBI exonerated. FBI widely criticized for dropping the ball in regard to the Boston bombing. Turns out they went back to the Russians and asked them for more info, and the Russians wouldn't give it, so it's all Putin's fault. Well, since when did it become the Russians' responsibility to do our intelligence gathering for us? Since when was it Vladimir Putin's responsibility to keep jihad bombs from going off at the Boston Marathon? It's appalling that that was even put forward, but it shows the indefatigable commitment of the mainstream media, the New York Times, and all the rest of them to keep up these fictions, these pious fictions about Islam being a religion of peace, and the idea that separating out Islam from terrorism and never speaking of the two together, no matter how often jihadis do, is the right course and the course that will lead to peace and harmony. It's ridiculous. It costs lives. It could have been prevented. But we see the same thing happening now. You know, Jay Leno and the First Lady are on board, and so everything's okay now. But you notice that Michelle Obama has said nothing about the belief system that motivates these people or what might be done to stop it. Not a word. And the usual chorus of world leaders are echoing, as Jamie quoted David Cameron, the idea that this has nothing to do with Islam. Muslim leaders are writing in the Huffington Post and CNN, those are two that I've seen recently, that this has nothing to do with Islam and it violates the Quran and Islamic law. Just before this started, Ahmed Bedir, who is a Muslim leader in Florida, he used to be with CARE, he tweeted out that Boko Haram is violating the Quran. And so some lady wrote back to him and got me in on it. You know how Twitter works. You just get involved in these conversations with people. You don't even know them, and then it's too late. But anyway, she said, well, why don't you debate Spencer about this? Because I have an article today at Truth Revolt about this that says that shows how they're operating exactly according to Islamic doctrine. And he said, well, you know, I don't debate with intellectual terrorists. And that's the tenor of the exchange always. The articles in CNN and the Huffington Post that spoke about how this completely violated Islam, they quoted the Quran about being nice to people, various be nice to people quotes from the Quran, and said, see, Islam doesn't justify the kidnapping of schoolgirls and the pressing them into slavery. Neither one of them quoted chapter 4, verse 3 or chapter 4, verse 24, and also several other passages which refer to the permissibility of a man to have 4 wives plus the captives of his right hand. What are the captives of the right hand? Those are women you kidnap and force into sexual slavery. That is according to the Quran, according to Islamic doctrine. I didn't make that up. I did not, with my Zionist black arts, cast that into the Quran such that even the Muslims would read it there, but it never was there before in that lovely book of peace. It's always been there, and it's always been interpreted this way. If you read the article at Truth Revolt today, or just look it up for yourself anywhere, you can see that there were quite recently, just in the last few years, several Islamic leaders, a feminist actually, she was actually described as a feminist, politician, a member of parliament in Kuwait, and an imam in Egypt, and another imam in Saudi Arabia, all of them saying, hey, we should be taking sex slaves. It's in the Quran, and, you know, it'll help the men relax. We ought to be doing this, and justifying it according to the Quran. None of these articles that have been coming out, and there will be more, that are saying that this has nothing to do with Islam, address that or even mention those verses. I would be more inclined to think they were honest presentations if they would at least say, well, yes, there are some Muslims who say that the Quran justifies this because of chapter 4, verse 3 and 424 and so on, and the captives of the right hand. But this is why that's a wrong understanding. This is why that really ought not to be taken as such, and why we have to fight within the Muslim community against that idea. They don't do any of that. They just don't even mention it because they know. I mean, how many of you were familiar with the captives of the right hand in the Quran? You know, they know. Most infidels are not aware that these passages exist. And so they can take advantage of our ignorance to render us complacent such that we do not offer the proper resistance. And that's the idea. That's the program behind this. So anyway, Arab Winter Comes to America. The new book is all about this denial and the cost of it for us. The cost is obvious. It's getting people killed. The denial, however, continues and is, if anything, despite Jay Leno, thicker than ever. I'm not sure Jay Leno has any idea that Sharia has anything to do with Islam. And if the first time he's called Islamophobic, I'm sure he'll go home. But meanwhile, it is very important, it is of cardinal importance that we all understand what is being done here, what this campaign to rule out of the public discourse any honest discussion of Islam and jihad, what it means, how it operates, and what the cost of it is. And we have to stand up and resist it at all costs. And I can tell you, you know, it's not just me here again, but I know so many of my friends and colleagues, Noni Darwish, Pamela Geller, Wafa Sultan, many, many others, Ayan Hirsi Ali, notoriously at Brandeis. We get invited to speak somewhere, and then CARE says, you know, this person is a bigoted, racist, Islamophobe. And the organizers say, oh, okay, well, we'll cancel them. Yes, sir, how high? Well, why are we kowtowing to this Islamic supremacist agenda that is ultimately inimical to the freedoms that we are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States and by universally understood notions of human rights? Why are we bowing to this? Why are we not standing up and saying, we are going to listen to these people, we are going to have this public discussion about this, and you are not going to intimidate us into silence? I can tell you that, you know, we are here the children and heirs of the greatest civilization the world has ever known, the one that has given the world its understanding of human rights that prevail everywhere except in Islamic lands, the one that has given us the idea of the dignity of all people before the law, the equality of dignity of all people before the law, that is, the freedom of speech and so on. But that these freedoms are indeed gravely threatened today. And there is a concerted effort to make it impossible for us even to speak out in resistance for fear of being branded as hateful and bigoted and so on. And so, in acquiescing to this in any way, great or small, we become our own worst enemy. And you know, as the great philosopher Walt Kelly said in his cartoon Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us. It's not too late, and it's never too late as long as free people are still breathing. But I implore you that nobody is going to do this job for us. And we have to start to stand up and speak out now wherever we are and whatever our situation in life, because our freedoms are being threatened. And this is a very concerted, very skillful, and very clever campaign. But you know what they're about, you know what they're doing, and it is up to us now to stand up and to preserve our freedom and way of life. Thank you very much. So if you have questions, comments, agreements, disagreements, death fatwas, I would ask you to please keep them brief and make it a question, not really a statement or your own lecture.
Also, Robert,
and come up to the microphone.
C-SPAN is here today, so all questions, please line up at the microphone. So
yes, it's a C-SPAN thing. If your question is not on the microphone, it will not exist.
Robert, thanks for the informative discussion.
Thank you.
I have a question that goes to the nature of Islam. Daniel Pipes, who's a noted lecturer, writer, scholar, he edits the Middle East Forum. He uses the term Islamists and moderate Islam. And he points out that this division between moderate Islam and the Islamists is not echoed by people like yourself and Raymond Ibrahim, who say that there are observant Muslims and non-observant Muslims, that if you are an observant Muslim, you have to follow all of the strictures of the Quran, which includes the Jihad. So I'd appreciate your comment on this. Are there really anywhere moderate Islam, moderate Muslims?
There are a lot of moderate Muslims, but there's no moderate Islam, and that's the distinction. If by moderate you mean Muslims who are just ordinary folks who want to live their lives and have a job and have a family and take care of themselves, there are plenty of those who are never going to wage jihad against the West. However, is there a moderate Islam? In other words, is there a form of Islam, a sect, a school of jurisprudence, some sort of group of any kind that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and the necessity of the believers to subjugate them as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law? There is no such thing. It does not exist. Militant Islam is the problem and moderate Islam is the solution would be a great idea if moderate Islam existed, or if it could be viably invented. But it does not exist. All the sects of Islam, the Sunnis, the Shiites, even the Sufis, all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, all teach warfare against and subjugation of unbelievers. Muhammad taught it. Muhammad acted upon it, according to the stories about him in the Hadith. The Quran teaches it, that you have to fight against the unbelievers until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. That is chapter 9, verse 29. And so, there's many, many other verses, but not to prolong this overly. The point is that the Quran teaches it, Muhammad teaches it, which means it's Sunnah, and the Quran and Sunnah make up Islamic law. All the schools of Islamic law teach it, and all the sects of Islam teach it. There are plenty of Muslims who don't want to kill us or subjugate us. Great, I'm glad they exist, and I readily acknowledge that they do. But they do not have a theological basis within Islam to point to say, we really ought not to be waging jihad.
So the moderate Islam, the moderate Muslims, are just non-observant, is that right?
Yeah, well, they may be very devout in some ways, you know. I mean, Zuhdi Jasser tells me he prays 5 times a day and so on. But there are these teachings of Islam that he's obviously not following, you know. I mean, he told me, after I wrote my biography of Muhammad, The Truth About Muhammad, which is based on the earliest Islamic texts, Zuhdi told me, you know, I very much object to your book about Muhammad. Why? Because Muhammad was a wonderful man, and you have him doing all these terrible things in your book. And I said, well, I worked from the earliest Muslim texts about Muhammad. Where should I have gone otherwise? And he said, I'm not saying that those are not the earliest texts. I don't have any others, but I just know he was a wonderful man. Well, you know, I came to Casablanca for the waters. Yes.
He stole my thunder. I was going to say, is it not true in the Quran that if a Muslim has a relationship or finds an infidel, they can do 3 things. They can behead him, they can take him as a slave, or if he changes into believing in the true Allah, let him go. So, on that topic, if you truly are a believer of the Quran, what's this moderate Muslim business?
Well, yeah, you've got a point. Chapter 47, verse 4 of the Quran says, when you meet the unbelievers in battle, strike at their necks, cut off their heads, and then take captives, bind them firmly, and then there's either you ransom them, enslave them, kill them, or free them outright, depending on what is good for Islam. And that's Islamic law based on the Quran, on that passage, chapter 47, verse 4. So, you know, that's actually a very pertinent verse in light of Boko Haram having abducted all these schoolgirls. They are talking about ransoming some of them for release of jihadi prisoners in Nigeria, and they are enslaving some of them. And those are 2 of the options that are explicitly laid out in the Quran for what they can do. So, there you go.
I'm appalled and frightened when the New York Police Department has probably had so much pressure from the Muslim lawyers that they are no longer investigating what is going on in the mosques in New York.
Yeah, actually, in the book, I have a couple of chapters about the ongoing efforts by Muslim organizations to stop any surveillance of Muslims or mosques, and they specifically targeted the New York Police Department's efforts to surveil Muslim communities. And the new mayor de Blasio in New York recently actually ended that program, as he had promised to do, at a rally that groups with links to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood threw for him last summer. And so the thing is that it's clear, even if there wasn't any, you know, we always hear in the news stories about the NYPD program that was ended. The NYPD program of surveillance of mosques did not actually uncover any jihad plots. Oh, well then, let's dismantle it. But now that it's dismantled, let me ask you this. What if you're a jihad terrorist and you're reading the paper and you say, the NYPD, you see, the NYPD is not surveilling mosques or Muslim communities anymore? Well, I'm going to New York. Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Spencer, thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. I have a comment request. Can we stop calling it the mainstream media? Can we call it the mass media? Because they are certainly not mainstream.
Well, I think they are mainstream in terms of the fact that most Americans are not here today. They don't know anything about this. If they did hear about it, most Americans would think, well, I'm not going to go to that racist, bigoted gathering. And, you know, who are the Lakers playing? Most Americans have no idea about this because the media is mainstream. They're not mainstream in terms of the representation of the truth or accuracy, but in terms of their dominance of the discourse.
But it smacks of the Democrats on the judicial hearings for Supreme Court justices that Alito and Roberts are out of the mainstream.
Yes.
It should be mass media. We should not concede to them.
Well, the idea
what they're
that
saying is mainstream.
There's an ongoing effort. This is actually just part of it. The effort to demonize the foes of jihad terror is part of a larger effort, really, I think, by the left in general, to rule all their opposition outside the realm of acceptable discourse. And so, yeah, those justices say things that the left doesn't like, so they're extreme, and they're not mainstream. And all of us are extreme. And there isn't any opposition they recognize, just like the Islamic groups don't really recognize any legitimate criticism of Islam. They don't recognize any opposition as being legitimate. And it's an authoritarian, ultimately a totalitarian impulse that we must resist at all costs. Yes.
Thank you. I sometimes feel like this is an uphill battle, and I don't know how to proceed sometimes.
Well, David,
we're battling the LAPD here. We're battling the Sheriff's Department, and
they've got all the money, all the power, all the politicians, all the media. All we have is the truth. We will win. Yes.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because sometimes I'm almost at this point ready to give up. But anyway, Ayaan Hirsi Ali says the solution to this is to convert as many Muslims to Christianity. She said that, I think, in her second book.
That's an interesting thing for an atheist to say.
It's true, yes. And she readily admits she's an atheist, but she says that's the solution. Mm-hmm. I'd like your opinion on all this. And also, how can we beat this battle?
Well, I think that's one aspect, certainly. And I have great admiration for people like David Wood and Nabil Qureshi, who is actually a convert from Islam. I don't know if you're familiar with David Wood and his work, answeringmuslims.org. But David is a Christian missionary who goes head on and debates with Muslim apologists and so on. And I think that is one important aspect of this overall struggle, that there is a spiritual aspect to it. There are values that the Judeo-Christian tradition upholds that Islamic tradition denies, and that we should be unapologetic in saying so. And I have no trouble with believers of proselytizing faiths trying to proselytize among Muslims. I also am in favor of a larger effort that really just confronts them head on. I mean, like, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States government imposed Sharia constitutions. And that was the will of the people, and we were all about democracy. And so the United States government, we gave our blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan to impose systems of law that deny equal rights to women and to gays and to non-Muslims. And you know, I think, wouldn't it have been something, wouldn't it have been amazing if the US government had gone in and said, well, we're actually for freedom. We're standing here, we're here for real freedom, not just talk, political talk and sloganeering. But we're going to stand for a society that allows for equality of rights of all people and the freedom of speech. And we're not going to allow Islamic law to have that kind of influence, that kind of hegemony in the government, because it's inimical to notions of human rights to which we are committed. And then we would have offered a viable alternative to them that I think a lot of Muslims would have supported. Because Muslims, as you can see in the Islamic world, and the fact that there's always this pendulum swinging back and forth in Islamic societies between the imposition of Islamic law when things are going bad, and they say, see, things are going bad because we disobeyed a law. And so we need to impose Islamic law and obey Allah, and then everything will be great. And then they impose Islamic law, like in Iran, and it's terrible. And people don't want it. They don't want to live under it. It's just as inhuman for them as it is for anybody else. And so they start to relax it. And it swings the other way. And I think if we had offered those people a voice and an alternative, then that would have made a big difference too, but we didn't. But in any case, I'm in favor of all approaches to the same thing. Hi, Paul.
Hi. You will recall that immediately after 9/11, the Pope, the bat-eared Prince Charles, and the President of the United States all rushed out to beam their wisdom towards us by telling us that Islam was a religion of peace. Do you suppose that this is because they used decades of their lives as an opportunity to catch up on some sleep, or because they are suffering from the worst kind of intellectual flatulence?
I don't know. It beats me. You know, the current Pope recently put out a document in which he said, in passing, that the authentic that Islam and the authentic understanding of the Quran reject all forms of violence. And I think, did he ever actually crack open a Quran even once? Anyway, I don't understand the commitment of these people to this idea and the tenacity of it, except that it's maybe witness to the effectiveness of the ongoing efforts by groups like CARE to make people think that if you speak about this honestly, innocent Muslims will suffer. They'll be victimized. Racist, ignorant, redneck yahoos will go out and storm mosques and kill pious Muslimas who have done nothing wrong their whole lives, but all they did was make chicken and pita. Now, that is, I think, a very potent idea, that people are afraid that innocent people will be victimized. And certainly no innocent people should ever be victimized. But it has been very cannily used by Islamic groups to stifle any criticism and to block out any truth-telling of this. You know, have you seen the 9/11 Museum controversy? That the 9/11 Museum's about to open, and they had a movie, they invited some people in to see their exhibits, and they showed them this movie they're going to have there about Al-Qaeda, because these guys were Al-Qaeda. And there was the local imam there. He said, this is terrible, you can't show this, and there's this big protest now trying to pressure the museum into dropping this film about Al-Qaeda. And the pretext is that people will think, all the racist, ignorant yahoos that we know populate the US, they will all think, oh, Al-Qaeda says this must mean what all Muslims think, and then they'll go out and shoot innocent people and so on. Now, the idea that anybody would think that because Al-Qaeda thinks this, therefore all Muslims do, is just as silly as saying because the mafia does this, therefore all Italians do. And I have more faith in the American people and in the common sense of human beings in general to fall for that. But the 9/11 Museum being made up of New York liberals, I don't have much hope that they're not going to toe the line. But the thing is, it beats me, but people do really seem to believe this nonsense. And I don't know. You know, Glenn Beck actually said a few years back that I have read the Quran and I can tell you absolutely that Islam is a religion of peace. And I think, well, he should have opened his eyes when he read it. Anyway, last two questions.
Following up on something you said earlier about the fear of speaking out against Islamic extremism within the CIA, the FBI, the military, Is this attitude, this policy, deeply penetrated throughout the federal government as well as state and local governments? And in relationship to that part of the question, there were, I believe, 9 generals who've left the military. Are those terminations related to anything that has to do with Islamic terrorism?
Not direct.
Their stand.
The termination of the generals is not directly related. It may be that Petraeus knew more about Benghazi than was convenient, and so suddenly his affair was discovered. But that's about as close as it gets, as far as I know. As far as the military and the intelligence community in general, at this point, I think it's very deeply penetrated the whole apparatus that you're not to speak of Islam in connection with terrorism. But it's the same situation as prevailed under Bush when I was training, that there were mid-level people who were quietly trying to work around their superiors. It's just much harder now than it was then.
Hi, thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
I wonder if you're aware of, and if yes, how do we fight the indoctrination that's going on in our schools with our children? My kids go to Catholic school, and my 2 high school daughters came home talking about a video that was shown by the Diversity and Inclusion Club that paralleled Christianity and Islam, and even introduced the term Chrislam, which, as a mother of kids in Catholic school, shocked me. And my son's 8th grade class was made to go to a mosque and sit and listen to what was just, you know, I'm sure a devout Muslim believes with all their heart all the good things about their faith, but some of what this woman told the kids was just not true. I volunteered to go as a chaperone because I wanted to know what was said. The only thing that gave me any peace was that my son and all his friends were sound asleep for her lecture. But, you know, a lot of the kids were listening, and how do we fight this?
Well, I think that it's very important that we do fight it, and that one way you can do that is to shed light upon it, and go to the school board, go to the local media, ask them why they are having a field trip to the mosque and not to the synagogue, not to the church, not to the Hindu temple. Why are they going to this mosque that has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, which I guarantee you it does, and I can show you what to look for. And why this one religion is given this favorable treatment when the others are not, and how does this square with the understanding of a public school and the separation of church and state, religion and state, and so on. And make as much of a controversy about it as you have the time and energy to do, and persist when doors are closed, and keep on speaking out. Call meetings of concerned parents, and issue press releases sending them to the school board and to the local media, and explaining what exactly is wrong with this, and why it's unacceptable to our values, and why it is endangering us. And when that happens, of course, you will be vilified and tarred as a bigot and a racist and an Islamophobe. But what I'm trying to do here today is say, keep on even in the face of all that.
Thank you. There are certain teachers who turn the other way when they see me coming because they don't want to talk to me.
Good. Keep around the other side. That's it. Thanks very much, and I'll be out signing.
Robert will be signing books right outside.
Thanks again for coming.
Acid should be poured down infidels' throats, and no one complained because they were afraid of being called racist and Islamophobic. And so this situation, this phenomena, is today making us vulnerable to jihad and making it impossible for us to protect ourselves from a threat we can't name and are not allowed to name. And so the most important part of my introduction now is that a hero has entered the stage. Robert Spencer, a New York Times best-selling author, director of Jihad Watch, which is a program of our Freedom Center. Jihad Watch is one of the most important sites on the face of the earth, just slightly below in importance to Front Page Magazine and the Glazoff Gang. He is the author of 13 books, and now his new book, Arab Winter Comes to America, The Truth About the War We're In. And the themes in full detail he's discussing and describing this phenomena that I'm referring to. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our modern day Alexander Solzhenitsyn, facing yet another evil empire. But this time, this empire is the empire of the alliance between the left and Islam. This is an empire that, as we sit here at this very moment, is unleashing lethal blows at the foundations of our civilization. And all the while, this empire has succeeded in speaking the truth about its existence and actions, thought crimes and hate speech crimes. So what's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is that with its conniving and vicious agenda, this evil empire has succeeded in making kafir. Muslims' impurities are cleansed, humiliation is avenged, and honor is restored by the bloodshed achieved through mutilation of the infidel. The jihadists in Kenya engaged in another intriguing selection process. They freed Muslims and tortured and murdered non-Muslims. One of the survivors recounted how the jihadists asked him the name of Muhammad's mother, and when he couldn't answer, they shot him. Women and children who could not recite the Quran or name the mother of the Prophet were killed. The jihadists released anyone who could prove they were Muslim by reciting a Muslim prayer. In response to this horrifying act of terror, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron led the way perfectly for the West in the context of the mindset that now prevails in our culture. He condemned the attacks, but implored everyone, begged everyone to keep in mind that the victims in Kenya's Westgate shopping mall and what they suffered had nothing to do with Islam. And as we know, this is the prevailing mindset in our leadership, in our media. When the media reported on what happened in Nairobi, the word Islam somehow eluded the reports and the reporters' imaginations. The jihadists were referred to as militants, maniacs, gunmen, etc. We know this story well, ladies and gentlemen. It's the story of our civilization's surrender to a totalitarian and vicious ideology.
Robert Spencer argues that there are radical jihadists working in the U.S. today as part of a larger international jihad network that has been involved in many events over the past years, including the Arab Spring. This is a little over an hour.
Thank you very much. Michael mentioned the Glazov Gang. It's a TV show that we run at Front Page Magazine, and it would not have been possible for not my producer. Annie, can you stand for a minute? Please give her a hand. She made Front Page's TV show possible. Thank you. And my show wouldn't be so successful if Robert wasn't running it on Jihad Watch every week. Thank you, Robert. On September 21st, 2013, the Islamic terrorist group Al-Shabaab launched its 4-day siege of Kenya's Westgate shopping mall, turning it into a literal slaughterhouse. The jihadists raped, tortured, beheaded, dismembered, castrated, gouged out eyes, amputated fingers, and hung hostages on hooks from the roof. Now, I'm sorry to bring this up during our lunch. I don't mean to be ruining our lunch here today. But the reason I bring it up, ladies and gentlemen, is that that barbaric terror gave the Islamic stamp to that slaughterhouse. Because in Islamic theology, ritual murders involving torture, dismemberment, and mutilation are considered necessary sacred acts against the truth about its evil. It's labeled as evil itself. To oppose this evil is evil. And so saying the truth about Islam is now categorized as hate speech, racism, Islamophobia, etc. So I want to finish my introduction by just talking about Robert, what's happening to him, and who he is. Because these slanders that the evil empire is using are cast at him every day. The unholy alliance of the left and Islam have attempted to dehumanize him through their smears and slanders and name-calling. But I want to talk just for a little bit about Robert Spencer himself, because I'm very interested in how the Soviet Union tried to wipe my father out of history and tried to dehumanize him for standing up against the Soviet Empire. And they have tried to dehumanize Robert. He's a hateful man. He's an Islamophobe, etc. But I want to spend 2 minutes, if people want to know about Robert, come and ask me. If these people in the media think he's a hateful person, come and talk to me, because I've known him for more than a decade. I hang around with him. We talk on the phone all the time. And I think it is important to say, number one, I just want to say, for people that might not know a little bit, this wasn't an obsessed man with Islam that wanted to come forward and just start hating all Muslims. This was actually a person that was on the phone brainstorming one day many years ago with a publisher. I think it was at Regnery, to my my best knowledge. And they were brainstorming, and the person said, hey, why don't you write about Islam? It's an important topic right now, etc. This is, in many ways, Robert is a reluctant ideology, a surrender that is transpiring right now, right before our eyes. Because of the left's chokehold on our permitted boundaries of discourse, our leadership, in our media, in academia, in our higher literary culture, we cannot fight, let alone name the enemy that at this very moment is taking us down bit by bit. On the Glazov Gang this week, Mark Dury, that was on, used a very interesting metaphor. He said that there's a huge instinct in many people that when they're having, what's a good word to use? When they're being beaten up, I didn't want to use certain words, when they're being beaten up and they have a blindfold on, there is an instinct and a desire not to take the blindfold off, to see who's beating you and to try to save yourself. And so this blindfold, at this moment, is the metaphor to what's happening. The kidnapping of the Nigerian girls, when the leader of that extremist group praises Allah and talks about selling them. This is encoded in Sharia. In Islam, this is inspired and sanctioned by Islam in terms of slavery and rape, but we don't, of the kafir, but we don't hear this in our media. We know about the Tsarnaevs of the Boston Massacre, all the jihadi themes of Tamerlan and Johar, and yet the media the entire time was struggling. Was it the boxing? Was it the brain damage from the boxing? Was it the rap music? And this is what's happening because there's something that can't be named. And I could go on and on, ladies and gentlemen. I think Fort Hood serves as an example, that we had a quote-unquote psychiatrist in the U.S. Army teaching in lectures that